Well, hi everyone. I'm Lee Newman, and actually, I was really enjoying Max's slide of Alice Hamilton. You know, there were two requirements for her to go on the faculty at Harvard. One was that she promised not to try to come to the Harvard Faculty Club. Yeah, and my other favorite one was that she not ask for tickets to the Harvard-Yale game. But what I'd like to do, when we were putting together this...
She was also asked not to march in the graduation processions.
And not march in graduation, correct. How unseemly that would have been, right, for those Harvard professors. When we were putting this together, one of the things that we thought would be helpful to help set the table for the rest of our sessions would be for us to talk a little bit about to try to make sure that we have some common language across our various disciplines when we hear words like causality and causation, to talk a little bit about how does climate change link to human health. We have to have some shared framework for how we talk about causation. And when I mentioned this to Rick, this was sort of a great Rick moment because I mentioned Bradford Hill. And Rick goes, I wrote a paper on that. I'm going like, of course you did. You've written like thousands of papers. And then he sent me the paper, and I read the paper, and I love that. You know, I really did. So we're going to come back and touch on some of that today, maybe in your honor. And know where I'm coming from. So I started out, well, I've had a few careers, but in recent memory, I've been a pulmonary physician turned public health practitioner and researcher. And so I head up one of the, it's interesting because we have one of the rare convergences in this country of having centers of excellence in Colorado around occupational health and safety. And I have the privilege of heading up one of those centers here in Colorado. And at the same time, we have those of us from around the world here who are trying to understand climate in relation to occupation and occupational hazards, as well as the environment. So we'll come back to that as a theme, I think, during the next few days. But what I'm going to do right now is talk about this concept of how will we, as a group, as a consortium, how will we establish if climate and climate change are causing more or different human disease in a complex system? We've now heard that a couple of times today. And that's an important phrase to add because this is a complex system. When we're dealing with the climate, it's complex. When we're dealing with other exposures, it's complex. When we're dealing with humans, anytime you throw humans into the mix, it's complex. And I'm always sort of reminded that there are some things that are just complicated. So putting a man on the moon, that's complicated. It's hard to work it out, but once you work it out, you can actually repeat it. What's complex is when you get humans involved. So raising 2 children, which I've done, I can tell you that's complex, right? You may think you're going about it the same way, but you don't get a reproducible result. So how do we tend to think about causation, about the cause, the relationship that we're looking for? And there's been a traditional medical model approach, which goes back to the 1800s, and we tend to think about Koch's postulates, which work out fine. You know, you have people with a disease, you find a bug in their system, a pathogen. You know, you can do all the things to take that pathogen, grow it, put it into another organism, show that it causes disease, right? That works actually fine for the limited world of infectious agents that actually lend themselves to being found, cultured, and re-injected. But in the public health parlance, we've had to take another step in terms of establishing causality. And things get a lot murkier. They get a lot more challenging. What do you do when a bug, a pathogen, is not the exposure of interest? And here we tend to rely on a flawed but still rather helpful rubric called the Bradford Hill criteria. Just as a show of hands, how many people here are versed in Bradford Hill? So we have about a half and half. And so I think that's sort of perfect for why we wanted to have me take a couple minutes to walk through this. But we're not going to stop there. We're actually going to, I think, we should at least mention that another strategy is to conduct interventions. And we have here some wonderful interventionists who are working on CKD and testing interventions and assessing what works as a way of measuring whether there's a cause and effect relationship between certain climatologic events and human health. So we have the ability sometimes to actually create interventions to examine whether there's causality. But let's focus for a few more minutes on Bradford Hill. So in order to think about Bradford Hill, you have to kind of think the way that I think as an environmental and occupational health exposure geek. And the way that I think about it is I conceptualize climate as an environmental hazard. So if you kind of take that as your starting premise, it could have been indium, it could have been beryllium, it could have been silica, but here we're actually talking about climate itself. Then you can think about exposure to climate as having both direct and indirect ways of impacting human health. And that impact on human health, we've heard ample examples this morning. Some of them are direct, some of them are indirect. They may be causing new diseases, new effects, aggravating existing diseases, spreading known diseases to places where they weren't going before. The levels can be at the level of an individual impact, which I experienced 2 weeks ago when I pulled out my inhaler for the first time in about a year, because actually it was an occupational problem, because I had gone to Singapore to give a lecture, and they were having wildfires blowing over from Indonesia. And I was about halfway through a lecture like this and ended up having to hit an inhaler. But most of what we're going to talk about here are going to be also looking for population-level impacts. So think of the environmental, think about this as an environmental hazard. And if you do, then you can start plugging it into this rather bizarre address that was given in 1965 by Sir Austin Bradford Hill. Now, Bradford Hill is an interesting character. He was born about 7 years after Koch published his hypotheses about how to test for infectious agents, and those postulates came out. And he lived until 1991 and had a distinguished career because among the things that he did was probably the first person to do a randomized controlled trial for a medical outcome. Fisher had actually developed randomized controlled trials in agricultural settings. But he was the first one to really take that. And actually what he did was he studied whether streptomycin worked for tuberculosis. He was also part of the team that published quite a body of evidence that demonstrated, starting in 1950, that cigarette smoking was linked to cancer. So this guy came out of the world of being a biostatistician, epidemiologist, and focused on occupational and environmental hazards, and prepared this address, which led to what we still heavily rely on today as Bradford Hill's suggestions for how we assess causality. And they're all listed right here, and some of them are very well explained in this address that he gave in 1965, and some of them are kind of vague. And right now I'm torturing about 108 graduate students who are having to read this paper and help understand how it relates to various kinds of exposures. But to touch on this briefly, I'll paraphrase Bradford Hill. But before I do, I want to tell you, why do we bring this up? When you can't directly measure whether there's cause and effect by taking the bacterium and injecting it into an animal and proving that it's causing disease, then you have to do it in an inferential way. And what are the lines of evidence? And essentially, you can think of these as the lines of evidence that we use to try to connect an exposure. In our case, the challenge is climate as an exposure to a human health outcome. And some of these lines of evidence carry more weight than others, I think we would argue. But what I would submit to you all is that what we're going to be doing during the next couple of days is we're going to be contributing different parts of the puzzle. Some of us are going to be talking about mechanisms. Some of us are going to be talking about epidemiology. Some of us will look at exposure and exposure risk in relation to a health outcome. And it actually can all be plugged into one or more of these components going back to Bradford Hill back in 1965. So to paraphrase Bradford Hill, when he talks about strength of association, that's the effect size. And actually what he says is essentially, he actually says that indirect, he doesn't say it this way, but he says size doesn't matter. But bigger is better when you're suggesting causality. So sometimes you may have a a weak association, but that's still real. But if it's a big association, say between some aspect of climate or temperature and a human health outcome, then that's really real, okay? Consistency is an important one because it's about reproducibility. And he says that essentially something that I was always taught in epidemiology is that an epidemiologist's best friend is another epidemiologist who finds consistent findings in different persons, in different places, and with different samples. So the idea that you have a separate replicate of your findings is actually really important for the work that we want to do around the world, establishing these relationships between climate and health. Specificity, by specificity, he was pointing out that the more specific an association is between a factor and an effect, the better. So you get a cleaner, you get your cleanest signal when you have, say, a rare exposure and a rare disease, and you can connect the two. And I had really the luck of having that experience in my own career by studying among nuclear weapons workers a rare metal that was usually used only in industry, it's called beryllium, and a rare disease that was caused by it. And I learned that specificity is actually your friend if you're trying to establish causation. Temporality. This one seems obvious to us. Whatever the hazard is, the exposure better precede the health consequence. Or you better be able to show that even if the health consequence, like my asthma, was already ongoing, and then I had the exposure to particulate air pollution from Indonesian wildfires, that it significantly worsened it. But somewhere in there I can show that there was an exposure that amplified the human health effect or that caused the human health effect. So cause and effect requires the cause to come first. The last ones are these, biological gradient. And I think this is an important one because it comes up a lot as we start connecting the dots as a group with those of us who are doing mechanistic research. The greater the exposure should generally produce a greater incidence of effect. That can be studied at the epidemiologic level, and that can be studied at the animal research level, for example, sometimes at the cellular level as well. The other part of why biological mechanisms are so important for us to be including in our discussions here is that it comes to plausibility. Sometimes we'll see two things that are related, and we go like, well, true, and unrelated. And why do we say that? We say that because we can't figure out a biologically plausible way in which this exposure causes that health consequence. And sometimes as communicators, we have to lead people through the lines of evidence that connect those dots. So how do you get from climate change to suicides in India? You have to walk people through, if you will, the biological mechanisms, the plausibility argument for how that can occur. Coherence is basically saying that epidemiologic and laboratory findings should agree. And the other opportunity I think that we have as a group is for us to be understanding how the research that people are doing at the population level and at the laboratory level are correlating with each other. How well do those fit together? And frankly, Rick, I think that you and some of your group, you guys are fantastic about making those connections. And the last ones are experiment and analogy. So what I want to leave you with is basically a core question for this consortium. How will our research contribute to establishing causality? And what I would encourage us to do is to use these kinds of terms, this kind of structured way of thinking about where we can best contribute to explaining the relationship between climate change, and health consequences. I put a couple of arrows to kind of suggest some of the areas where I think we may have greater strength or less strength to make those relationships as a consortium. But my point here today is to offer up a framework that gives us some common ground to discuss going forward. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
More comment than questions. I don't consider it torture. I don't think your students should consider it torture. I think this is one of the best papers that has been written in public health and medicine in the last century.
Yeah, no, it is. I was being a little facetious when I called it torture.
Yeah.
In fact, you may like this. I have them read Silent Spring, arguably the book that launched the American environmental movement, and go back and apply Bradford Hill's criteria to Silent Spring to understand how well did Rachel Carson fulfill the criteria from Bradford Hill. And we have some rich discussions.
The other comment I wanted to make, which I think is important in epidemiology, I don't know in terms of the audience here, that one of the things he does comment on, you don't see on that, is statistical significance. And he said, while it's relevant to explore, it is not a criterion for causality, which is a stumbling block throughout epidemiology.
Well, the other side of the coin is the view from the basic scientists, where we start with the biology, and then we move to the physiology, and then from the physiology we move to the disease, and then we look for the epidemiology after that. But I think, you know, the power is coming from multiple directions, and this is what you're basically saying. But you know, I think that there's a number of approaches to try to go after causation, but you know, some of us come from a different direction, but we want to converge it with you at the same place.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that I've already enjoyed here is that this is already a very interdisciplinary inclined group. I realize that there are people here who are coming with multiple layers of education, and they're bringing different kinds of past experience to it. So we're able to translate across our different disciplines and converge, I think.
Excellent talk. Really interesting ideas and important ones as well. It brings to mind some of the challenges that we have. You know, I mentioned those key health threats, and really what resonates with people as a symbol of climate change, and even if it doesn't to health, is the extreme events. However, we've always said no single event can be attributed to climate change, but a series of events and stumbling across that, which is kind of the key barrier to get to really say that Katrina was X amount caused by climate change, and therefore the added amount of burden of death and disease is X, which I think is a much more powerful argument than saying, you know, gradual warming, we got more ozone, we got more what. But I think that's starting to move forward with event attribution work that Stephanie Herring and folks at NOAA are doing. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or are familiar with that, but it seems to be gaining a lot of steam with the BAM's special report on extreme event attribution to climate change, and really, I think, giving us a huge opportunity.
Well, you know, I'm really interested in it because I'm probably one of the most ignorant people in the room around climate. And so I'm eager to hear from people about, you know, we have a lot of data on human populations. You know, we do large population studies on workers. And what I want to know is, can we take the kinds of data that we're collecting? It's longitudinal, but it's over just a matter of a number of years. And can we actually use things like extreme climate events to understand whether we're getting some signal on the health impacts in short periods of time, even though you all are used to working with centuries worth of data. So I'm just responding to one small piece of what you said, George.
Yeah. So Jonathan, and then quick follow-up on George, and a comment you said. So I think the attribution of these climate extremes to long-term climate change is really important. But you mentioned once you put humans in the mix, it gets complicated.
No, it's complex. It's even
So,
worse.
But I think that there are some cases where we need to be humble and say, you know, in many of these climate change health consequences, we will not be able to figure this out. We will not be able to disentangle decades of data on all sorts of determinants of disease, and we won't be able to figure many of them out. And I don't think we should commit ourselves to having to find cause and effect to all the health outcomes. On the flip side, because climate change means entering a new climate regime that has never been seen before, it will be difficult in many cases to extrapolate and go with statistics. And this is where the biological plausibility and using analogy, why so many of us have used El Nino as like well, these are unseasonal conditions, and that's the signature of, that's what climate change will look like, more extreme events. You know, that's where we gain most of our insights in sort of these analogies, but not to feel like we have to find cause and effect because of the things that are indeterminate that we will struggle with, and we shouldn't be overly concerned about not being able to answer the question.
Jonathan, I think you're absolutely right, and I think especially I forget who was saying it this morning. You know, we're talking about this as maybe it was Jay talking about a multiplier effect. Sometimes it's really not a cause and effect, but it's an amplification, right? We've had a number of people talk about that, and that's going to be really tough to disentangle because it's implying that there already are other contributing causes, right? So separating out the piece that we attribute is going to be really maybe impossible to do. But I think that the key here is that this is really, if you will, this is a toolkit, and you're going to pick and choose. And some of these we're going to have more to say about than others. And in some situations, you know, we may never get through half of these or a quarter of these, and maybe what we're going to rely on is going to be plausibility and biological gradient or analogy. But building the case that ultimately leads to the kind of health communication that we'd like to have, the marketing of what we know, which we'd like to do, is going to be built on which of these boxes are we able to check and say it with confidence.
See, Marty and Jerry, I think that'll be it for questions.
Just want to follow up on George, and I co-edit the BAMS issue with Stephanie, and so this is something that is sort of a bit of a frontier science in the climate, is to try to give a well-reasoned, fully experimental assessment of what the causality of an extreme event is. I don't want to go into the details of that because it is complex. Okay, it's complex science. And I think sometimes things get lost in that complexity because there are bigger pictures in that work. And one of the bigger pictures, I think, are when certain events are occurring now, is to be able to say that these are events that have previously been once every 4 generational, but now are perhaps once every generational. And saying that an event is changing that can now affect your lifetime, when before you wouldn't expect it to have even affected your grandfather's lifetime, I think is a very important narrative that gets lost in the complexity. So people can expect to be exposed to something in which climate change has had a hand, or anything else. It doesn't really matter what had a hand in it, but you may expect now to see this in your lifetime. And if something happens in your lifetime at least once, you should be prepared to mitigate that effect. Whereas if it happens once every 4 generations, you can say, well, you know, that's bad luck if you experience it. But some things are now going to be generational, and I think that's an important narrative.
Yeah, I think it is. And it's by analogy. If you go out on a hike here in Colorado and weather starts rolling in, you best not be exposed because we have a lot of lightning strikes in Colorado, right? And depending upon where you came from, it may never occur to you that lightning could kill. So I think that I think it's a very important point. I'll be interested to see what you guys are publishing.
Okay, Jerry?
This is really interesting because this has really a lot of parallels to what we try to do in climate science. And usually what we do is we do it in 2 stages. We call it climate change detection and attribution. So the first stage is, can we detect something that's happening in the climate system that's statistically really unusual? And so that's the first step. Okay, if there's something that's happening that's really unusual, now, and the next step is, can you attribute it to something, be it in the natural world or human activity? And so it's a 2-step process, detection, attribution. And so it turns out there's a lot of methodologies that you can develop to attribute changes in average climate conditions that are fairly well established. But now with event attribution, like George and Marty were just talking about, you're trying to attribute extreme events to a certain cause or particularly human activity. And the communication part of this, it's difficult, and this was actually taken up in the BAMS article, and also there's a National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences report that just came out this year on event attribution, that you have to communicate that climate change in extremes is shifting the odds. You're just getting a better chance of certain outcomes happening. It's not guaranteed it's always going to be that outcome, but it's a statistical thing that's kind of hard for people to grasp, I think. So they just want to say, okay, is this heat wave always, is a humans, you know, and you say, well, but it's not that easy. There's a better chance for this to happen. And there's now methodologies that are being developed to do that, but it's the same kind of process you're going through, where you're going through a kind of a checklist of steps to establish what we call attribution, you call causality. So it's an interesting kind of parallel kind of thing.
And we tend to start, though, from the exposure side of it and go, oh, this exposure is occurring. I wonder if the health impacts are, what are the health impacts? And so we tend to drive that way. Now, putting on my clinical hat, if I'm in my clinic seeing an injured worker, I'm asking questions about how, what was the exposure that caused that injury? And I work from the one out to the many, and then have to collect the data on what the exposure was. So, you have someone who comes in with hearing loss. You need to go back and understand where the exposure to loud noise at work occurred, right? So there's sort of two models that we use to converge on it. One which is kind of a public health, start from the exposure, we know it could be hazardous, let's find out who's getting hit by it. And then this other one which starts clinically, it says, I have individuals who look like they're having something bad happen to them. I need to go out and understand if there are more of those and is it related to an exposure.
So